Go ahead.
I'd like to call the State Board of Education working session to order on Tuesday, March 14th, 2017. Mr. Taylor, do we have a quorum?
Yes. Madam President, with 5 members and 1 on the phone, we have quorum.
All right. First order of business is? Yes. Sorry. So,
it's good to see everybody. We made it through all the weather. And we're glad to be here with you this afternoon after having come up with different contingency plans in case this couldn't happen.
Thank you for pride.
Yeah, absolutely. I know this document came to you quite late, and so what I wanted to do today was just offer a few comments, walk us through the changes we've proposed, and then open it up for questions and for discussion. And I wanted to just start by acknowledging that obviously this is a long journey we've been on. We've been talking about this really for a year now, or more, since the law was passed. And it's been a lot of work, and I think on all sides, and I just want to again appreciate and acknowledge the partnership and all of the good thought and discussion and feedback that's gone into this. And I think one thing that can be hard to keep our eye on when we're in the midst of everything we've been going through, all of the details and hearing from so many different stakeholders who have lots of different opinions, is the big picture of what we're aiming to do. So I just wanted to ground us in that one more time. And again, the biggest thing I think we've heard and that has driven and motivated us, certainly at OSSE, and I think all of us collectively, is the belief that having a common system across all of our schools in DC could be incredibly powerful. I think it can be powerful for parents and families as they're making school choices or as they are seeking to stay informed about their current schools. It can be powerful for educators in bringing folks together to learn from one another, to learn from best practices, and to be able to further the progress that's happening across our city. And we think that that idea of that common vision, that common system across all of our schools continues to be sort of what drives us and what keeps us going towards aiming to create the best system possible that works across all of our schools. Now, having a common system takes a lot as well. There are hard choices and hard conversations to be had along the way in coming together, and we know that ultimately what it will need to have a system that has broad buy-in means that it won't be the system that any one of us individually might design if we were coming up with this hypothetically ourselves, but instead it's all of us coming together to say sort of what is it that we can agree on as a great starting point to build on in the future, but as a great starting point for all of our schools when we first issue these ESSA ratings and the new school report card in the fall of 2018. And so we appreciate the robust public feedback we've had, and want to just again acknowledge and appreciate all of the work that you all have done to further that engagement, and especially want to just acknowledge Ruth, your chairmanship of the committee, and Karen and Jack, your leadership of the board. And I think that you all have pushed us to really ensure that the engagement can be as robust as possible, and that the feedback we're gathering is particularly meaningful because of that. During the public comment period, we received more than 250 written comments via email and through the survey. We also, as you all know, had strong attendance at all of the work meetings, and we're capturing notes during all of those in-person discussions. During the public comment period, we also held our LEA Institute, and the entire day was devoted to different aspects of the ESSA, and again, we're capturing the feedback that was shared in person there. And we also had a chance to meet with the DCPS Principals Cabinet that the Chancellor convenes, as well as the Learning Support Network, which is made up of principals from priority and focus schools under the ESSA, old ESSA waiver. And I think those discussions were also particularly helpful. And so the document we sent you earlier today is a reflection and a summary of all of the feedback we gathered through all of those channels, as well as the ongoing discussions we've been having. And I hope you can see that we gave very serious thought to all of the comments that were offered, and thought also carefully about what changes we can make now in the current proposal as it gets submitted to the U.S. Department of Education upon the board's approval, but also continued areas that we can keep looking at for the future as well. And I want to just start by acknowledging that this is a summary of the proposed changes. As you all may have seen, the U.S. Department of Education issued a new template for states to use that was issued midday yesterday. There are a couple of new requirements in that there are a couple of new requirements for states, regardless of which template they use to submit. And so we are still working on updating our full state plan, answering those additional areas, and we will get that to you. We're aiming for tomorrow to get that over to you all. But in the meantime, we wanted to start with a summary of the accountability sections, which will go in the new template, similar to the old one, and where the vast majority of the feedback was centered. Nearly all the comments and almost all the discussion were really centered around these areas. And so with that, I wanted to just walk you all through a little bit of what's in this document. I certainly won't go line by line, but wanted to share with you all the structure of the document and then the big areas and changes that we've made. So what you'll see is there's a short section at the beginning around our process and the comments that were gathered. And then the meat of this document is this section called Feedback Summary and Proposed Changes, where we walk through different areas of feedback we received. And for each area, we describe briefly what was in the draft state plan, the original January 30th draft. We share a summary of the feedback we received and then respond to that feedback, share sort of our thinking about that feedback and changes we are making where applicable. So the first section is around the weighting of domains within accountability frameworks, and as we've discussed before, this was a major area of feedback in terms of both volume of comments and the level of interest people provided. And in response, as you can see on page 3, we made the following changes. So in the elementary and middle school frameworks in particular, we kept the weight on growth at 40%, but lowered the weight on achievement down to 30%. So that had two impacts. It lowered the total weight that's on test-based measures and also made growth weighted more highly than achievement. We did not make a change to the high school weighting, though we addressed that further down in the document. And then those additional 10 points were allotted towards the school environment domain. So we increased that domain by 10 points, from 15 points to 25 points. Within the school environment domain, again, we heard a lot of interest on different measures to be included here, around particular measures that could be included, as well as just making this domain more robust generally. And so in response to that feedback, we made the following revisions. So one is including a new measure for an access and opportunities metric to be included in all frameworks under the school environment domain at 5 points. This new measure would be designed to promote well-rounded experiences for students in engaging learning environments, but also given that there are multiple ways that schools, I think, can achieve that, and I think a lot of the feedback was centered around actually wanting to provide flexibility for schools and wanting to not just see sort of rigid pathways, that we wanted to provide multiple options and look to develop this measure in a way that would provide that flexibility. And so this measure would be piloted in the 18-19 school year and used to formal accountability results from the 2019-20 school year. I wanted to flag that I think part of the developed interest in this area came from some of the public comments we received, and in particular people pointing to a similar index that Louisiana was creating as part of their state plan, and that was very helpful. This was actually an idea we had explored. We had worried that we wouldn't be able to develop it in time for the first year, and what was helpful in looking at the Louisiana example in particular was actually that they had laid out the same timeline that we note here. They gave sort of 3 years for the development, for the piloting and the implementation of this index within their own system. And then again, as noted, we increased the total weight. And then we also clarified how pre-K measures are incorporated. We had heard a few comments around people who are concerned about measuring attendance in pre-K, given both that pre-K is not compulsory. Compulsory attendance starts in kindergarten. And also just generally, we know from our data that we see higher rates of absenteeism in pre-K grades than in any other grade until high school. And so what we've done here is we are separating how in-seat attendance is calculated so that it's clear. We're distinguishing pre-K attendance from the upper grades, and also so that it can be gauged sort of relative to other pre-K classrooms. The next section is around attendance metrics, and again, we heard quite a bit of feedback in this area, and we made, the biggest update we made here was actually adding, I think this was partly in response to the feedback around attendance, but also partly just the desire to see growth incorporated more fully into the system generally. And so we actually shifted what was previously, we were calling it the 90% plus attendance metric, and we are now calling that addressing chronic absenteeism, which I think A, is clear about what it actually is meant to do, and B, is because there's actually two possible ways that schools can earn points on this, and we will take the best of whichever of those pathways. So we'll look at both pathways for all schools, and we'll give schools the benefit of whichever one they do better on. And so one pathway is the existing measure, which was the percent of students who are present for 90% or more of the school year. And then the second way is actually growth in that same metric. So looking at how growth is calculated based on your percent of students who are present 90% or more of the school year, and we'll give the best of either of those two pathways. The next section is around graduation rate metrics. And here, I think the primary thing we heard were people were very interested in the alternate graduation metric, and we're glad that we included extended rate graduation metrics generally, but also felt like there's not a need to have the separate 5-year and alternate, that actually combining them could create some benefits and an easy simplification. And so that's what we did. We removed the 5 years as a separate metric and increased the weight on the alternate graduation metric, since alternate graduation metric includes 5-year graduates within it. On high school growth, we did not propose any changes at this time, but wanted to just articulate again why we have not been able to do so. And again, we are still committed to fully exploring this, looking at all available options, and we pledge here to publicly report on our progress towards a high school growth metric no later than the 18-19 school year. And again, we are, I think, pursuing this as quickly and as fully as we can, looking at all available options there. On long-term goals, there were two clarifications we wanted to make. So again, just making clear that our goals for all students are the same. Our goal for all students is that we believe they can learn and achieve at high levels, and we want to prepare them for college, career, and life opportunities. And the standards that individual students are held to are the same regardless of background. We also just want to clarify, and we acknowledge that I think just as in the flurry of editing before we posted the draft state plan, that we caused some confusion accidentally. And so we clarify and clean up our language, distinguishing the long-term goals from the accountability system fully. They are entirely separate. Then there's a section around recently arrived English learners, and this was maybe not as high a volume of comments, but an important area that came up where people had expressed concerns about the assessment requirements for English learner students who are newly arrived, meaning they've been enrolled in schools in the U.S. for less than 12 months. And what we wanted to clarify here is actually we have a limited set of options under federal law, and in the OSCE response we lay out what the two options really are. The first option is to allow new arrivals to test in math and science, but not in English language arts in their first year. And that's the option we proposed in our draft plan. The second option is that you test new arrivals in all 3 subjects, but you don't count the ELA results. So basically the option is either you don't give the test in the first year, or you give it, but you don't count it. And we felt like that option was less appropriate because it requires students to take the test when we're acknowledging that they're not actually ready for it. So given that, we stuck with the first option as defined, but we thought it was important to sort of lay out that clarification on the reason there. The next comment was related to, or the next area of comments was related to the STAR rating system, and some folks who felt differently about the idea of a single rating, and some interest in a dashboard approach of seeing additional metrics laid out in a clear and understandable way. And what we want to clarify is while we both think that having a common accountability system is critical and that having a single overall rating provides important clarity for parents and families, we also agree that it's important to provide the additional information, not just in, and I think that the idea of a school report card and a dashboard don't have to be different things. They actually could be the same thing. And so we're certainly open to exploring a dashboard or other types of comments, other types of formats and layouts as part of the report card design process. And finally, as you all know, we've heard quite a bit of feedback around the submission dates and some interest in waiting until the September submission date. We believe that the April submission date remains incredibly important so that we can keep moving forward, so that we can give clarity to schools and to educators at the start of the 17-18 school year, and so that we can focus on the implementation of the system and clarity and accuracy and understanding in the implementation phase versus the design phase. And that doesn't mean that the system is locked in forever. Again, I think we will all continue to learn and this system and this foundation, but we felt like being able to shift from this design and engagement phase to implementation was critical at this time. And so pending the state board's review and hopefully approval, we will continue to work towards submitting the plan to the U.S. Department of Ed in April. And then finally, just at the end, we summarized what the specific changes were since they're sort of embedded within the text. And in Appendix A, what you'll see is we provide sort of side-by-side displays of what the old framework looked like and then the new model reflecting the changes we've described. And the highlighted areas show metrics or weights that have changed or been updated in some way. And so just before we open it up for questions or discussions, I just wanted to say again that we feel like we have given serious consideration to, again, all of the feedback and comments we heard. And while I think that there was a broad enough range that I don't think we would, there was any proposal actually that would have satisfied every single person we heard. It was just not possible given the range and depth of comments. I do think these are some substantial changes and thoughtful ones that we think are responsive and certainly have been shaped by all of the feedback we've heard from both the board and from stakeholders across the city. And so we look forward to getting you all a final, an updated version of the full plan and working with you all towards a vote on the 22nd.
Question? Comment?
Well, I'll just start just on a question on the environment. So you're adding points to attendance and re-enrollment, if I understand. So a couple of questions. One, I didn't hear a lot of call for that. I heard a lot of call for environment around climate, and so I'm wondering what the reasoning is for adding points to the attendance and re-enrollment. And then second is I'm a little confused on how this plays out. The well-rounded kicks in year 3, I understand, of those 5 points.
So the, sorry, go ahead.
No, and so in year 1 and 2, it's all of the addition, it goes down to 70%. I don't understand how you make the switch between adding these attendance and re-enrollment and then at the third stage adding in the well-rounded.
Yeah, so first, in terms of where the additional points, so there were 10 additional points allocated to school environment. In terms of where they went, 5 of them went to the new access and opportunities measure, and then the other points were redistributed among the other areas. I think given the total weight on attendance and re-enrollment, I think is not up from before, depending on metric. I may have that slightly off. But where we redistributed points a little bit. So one is that in-seat attendance was relatively low before, and we heard from schools that they wanted to keep it closer to 5%, in part because it's, again, a familiar attendance metric, but in part because the addressing chronic absenteeism addresses students when they get to the 90% threshold, but for students who are not missing 90% of school days, those absences are not necessarily accounted for, whereas in-seat attendance is an average across all students, and so that keeps that, is sort of in line with that focus on all students. In terms of the addressing chronic absenteeism, that, again, because that metric, we've added the growth component to it, we felt like that keeping that measure in place and keeping the weight on it felt important because, again, that now provides an opportunity for schools to show growth in that metric, even if they struggled with attendance previously. And so the additional 5 points was redistributed among multiple areas. On what happens before we develop the access and opportunities metric is that we would calculate the entire framework out of 95 points instead of out of 100. So the denominator would just be out of 95.
So then the denominator in effect is 100? I mean, in effect, we're measuring against.
So then it would be each of these points. So it would be 30 points out of 95, or 25 points out of 95, 40 points out of 95.
And so in year 1, so in year 3, I see that it drops 10 points. But in it drops, let me say it this way. The school environment, in year 3, school environment goes up 15 to 25, goes up 10 points.
Correct.
In year 1 before the access and opportunities kicks in, does it still go up 15, does it still go up 10 points or only goes up 5 points?
I'm doing it in I'm remembering off the top of my head, I think it goes to 21%. I think 25 out of 95 is something like 21%.
Just go on, I can't do the math, so just do. No one can make.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank you and your entire team for the enormous amount of work that went into this. You've demonstrated that you've listened not only to us but also to our constituents. My folks in Ward 2 have said repeatedly that there's one LEA in particular in DC that does not listen to the families' voices, and they were very keen on making sure that OSSE was listening, and the substantial changes that you made to reflect the input of parents and families is greatly appreciated by me and the majority of my constituents. I think that a move to reduce the pressure on testing and assessments is incredibly helpful. I was pretty agnostic on the growth versus proficiency, but you heard from other boards as well and did a lot of work to emphasize growth over proficiency, which is incredibly helpful, especially in boards where the students aren't at proficiency and aren't on track to get to proficiency in a reasonable amount of time. So I want to say thank you on all of that. There was a question that Ruth had about attendance and enrollment versus school climate. I actually think they're not that far apart because of the school climate is healthier and inviting. More students are going to go back and are going to re-enroll and are going to go to class. We learned that on the attendance advisory committee. Yeah, and so certainly I think they're very well connected, and you've shown that here. I certainly want to continue to put more emphasis on school climate, and whether that's a survey or whatnot. I think this moves in the right direction for what the families in Ward 2 told me they need. And I appreciate all the work that's gone into this. I don't really have any questions. I'm going to take a little more time and read through and talk to some key folks in my ward, but I appreciate the effort that's been made, and this is something that I'm pretty comfortable with at this point in time.
I appreciate the acknowledgement of the changes. In terms of the timeline, just one additional note, I think we agree that we hear a lot of interest in broader measures of school environment generally, right? And we agree that attendance and re-enrollment are actually important reflectors of school environment. We also hear the interest from the community in other indicators as well, and I think that's what's reflected in our putting a stake in the ground, not just saying we'll explore, but that by the 1920 school year, we will have a measure that is related to this access and opportunities pathway. I think the reason you see that it takes, while we're putting the stake in the ground on the timeline by which it will be developed, I think the reason we are building that in, just to build on Ruth's comment and question, is really because many of the other ideas that were raised, I think, are not ripe for inclusion in the first year, and I think merit development and then piloting in year 2, and then operational use in year 3. And I think that timeline and that being realistic about sort of what it will take to develop a measure that is rigorous enough, is countable enough, measurable enough to include an accountability system for points, while also being reflective of sort of the range of programming and the types of schools we have, I think takes time to develop. And I think that the timeline, again, put out in Louisiana is also reflective of that reality, and in seeing what some of the other states are doing in terms of having to say no to certain measures that they were very interested in, at least in the first year. And so I think this gives us the path to sort of get there and create that measure.
So just one final follow-up question, and then I'll pass along to whoever else would like. My understanding is there were 2 pilots then, one climate survey and one school environment. They will be related, it seems like, because they sort of are looking at some of the same issues.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that as we think about the access and opportunities metric, again, we're thinking about sort of multiple options for what could be reflected there, and so I think there is a path for those pilots to sort of come together at some point.
Okay, and then, so once those pilots are finished, or actually, I would assume that during the pilots you're going to see some sort of feedback. How will that be shared with the board, and then how will the board ultimately review and then approve incorporation into the accountability plan.
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly committed to continuing to work closely with the board and reporting back to you all. We're still working on, again, the full text of our full state plan, and we're thinking about what we can commit to realistically in there as a hard commitment in addition to our general to working with you all. So I think you can look for that.
But am I correct in that if the pilots are incorporated into the plan after they've been reviewed and everything, that approval would have to come back to us? Is that correct?
I'm not sure.
Okay. If we could get clarification on that, I'd appreciate it. I wouldn't want to write a blank check on a pilot that hasn't even been conducted yet.
Yeah,
So, great.
Thank you for hearing all our communities' concerns and what they really did.
Is someone speaking? Because I can't hear them.
I'm looking at so soft.
I'm so sorry. I'll use my children loud voice. I want to thank C for doing a wonderful job of hearing our communities. The growth and achievement was one that was a very strong voice that I was hearing in the community. One of the and of course the access opportunities. Thank you again for that. I just have a quick question on science because it is STEM, and as we look at the academic achievement, because we know, if I'm correct, they're taking science and tests in 5th grade and 8th grade. We'd just like to know why that particular those assessments are not used and given credit for the academic achievement.
Yeah, so science assessments are given in 5th grade, 8th grade, and then in high school when students do biology, of course. So it's given 3 times, which is the minimum required by federal law. And we're actually going to be talking about science, I think, quite a bit more starting in April as we bring more information about the DC Science Assessment back to you all. The only reason it's not incorporated now is because it's still so new. So last spring was the first operational year of a new science assessment aligned to the next generation science standards. Before that, we had a DC CAS science assessment that is not aligned to the new standard. And so those assessments are actually still being scored, the ones from last year, due to some procurement challenges on our end. But we'll be coming back to the board with more information on those. And I think once those assessments are scored, they're being given for the second time this spring. We will be going through those results. So by this fall, we will have 2 years of results on the DC Science to look at until we get building in. The other reason it wasn't incorporated is because it is given at 3 points in a student's career and not sort of given annually. We don't have the same ability to generate a growth measure on science. So again, in sort of that debate between growth and proficiency.
Okay. Thank you for that response. I just have one other question. Looking at the high school, I just need clarity in my mind. When you talk about the park, you're talking about 10th grade?
Yeah, so we are talking about the required high school assessment, which is geometry and English 2. Those are primarily taken by 10th graders, but not exclusively. So for example, if a junior was taking geometry as a course, they would take the geometry test that year that they were taking the course.
Okay.
And that's, again, one of the challenges around the high school growth measure, because about 70% of our students are on the most common pathway, which is they take the 8th grade math test in 8th grade, and then they take the geometry test in 10th grade, but about 30% of our students are not on that pathway. They're either more accelerated or taking a little bit longer.
I'm glad you brought clarity to that, because some of the schools that I spoke with, some of the school leaders that I spoke with were concerned with the geometry assessment that they take, because the children haven't completed geometry before they actually take the mark.
Yeah.
So that was a question.
And I think there were some challenges last year in particular and some confusion. This year we've worked very closely to both clarify our state assessment participation policy and provide clearer examples and guidance, but also to align it in particular with DCPS's assessment participation policy. So I'm hopeful that that has been addressed.
Okay. And then the last question I have is, where you have SAT, ACT, are you looking at the junior and senior classes that take the ACT and the SAT in the district?
Yeah, we would be looking at the administrations that the district government pays for, which is the spring of junior year and the fall of senior year.
So you will be able to measure growth with those?
I don't think so. That's not, right now, I think College Board does not have an approved growth metric they've developed off of SAT. That is one of the things, one of the many options we are looking at for high school growth in the future, but again, there's not a currently existing method.
I'm sorry, I still have one more. It's all high school.
Yeah.
That's what happens when we have a child in high school. These questions. For the AP and IB, because it's weighted 10 points, how many AP, IB, are you all up for discussion on that? Are you having meetings around that to determine what clarifies a school that have one AP and one IB, the scoring for that versus a school that has many different choices, or I don't understand.
Yeah, so the way that the AP and IB would be structured is it's based on both participation and performance. So on the participation side, it would be the percent of students who are taking the AP or IB exam, and then the performance would be looking at the actual scores on it. So it wouldn't in itself be, the number of courses by itself wouldn't determine that, but I get the point that sort of broader offerings will likely allow more students to participate, certainly. And I think this is an area that DCPS has been looking at expanding their AP offerings. We have, I think, some work within OSSE that we do to encourage this, particularly around subsidizing the exam fees for low-income students from the state level, and some other programs to just incentivize the proliferation of advanced course options generally. So we'll keep looking at sort of other things that we can do to support schools that don't have as many programs right now. But I think the general trend we've seen in DC is that both participation is increasing. We see more and more students taking at least one AP exam, and then we see performance also edging up very slowly.
Okay, Laura asked to be next, y'all come.
Thanks. I didn't even hear all of that, but I have to run back into this meeting. I just first wanted to echo what some of my colleagues have said in terms of appreciation for the interest in hearing and incorporating public comment. I think that is so important for all kinds of reasons that I've talked about before. So first is just an acknowledgement. And then I have two sets of questions related to transparency and process. So the first is related to the series of suggestions in the state board memo that talked about setting up task forces that were either co-chaired by SBOE or had some configuration of a number of actors where there would be real transparency associated with how factors are determined for school year 18-19 and what gets included. And then the second, I just lost my second one. If you want to start with that, maybe the second will come to me. Thanks.
Sure. So again, I think we did not focus on sort of the specific configuration of like how those decisions would get made in this particular document. I think we are putting some thought into, again, what we could include in the additional text that will come to you all as part of the full state plan. I think we're certainly committed to transparency in reporting out to you all, and we'll investigate Jack's question as well in terms of what, if anything, might need to come to you all for additional approval, formal approval, but certainly at minimum, reporting out to you all about any changes or the results of these pilots as we're exploring them. I think that the actual structure of how those options are investigated and all of the work that needs to go into them, we need to do a little bit more thinking on, so I'm not sure we'll be able to fully finalize that right now, but I think we understood and appreciated where those recommendations were coming from, and I think some of it depends on sort of the what types of decisions we're talking about being made in different ways.
Okay, and I remembered the other one. Could you talk a little bit about how you are thinking about either a dashboard to accompany the star rating and some that incorporates these criteria, or what kinds of principles you are thinking through in terms of how all of this information gets rolled up and communicated out to the public?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. I'll say that I think we are definitely early in our thinking there. I think the most important thing is really whether you call it a report card or you call it a dashboard or you call it something else, I think it will definitely be a way of showing parents and families the specific breakdown of information, including things like showing how a school did on growth and showing how they did on achievement in distinct ways, including how they did on addressing chronic absenteeism and on English language proficiency, showing those in very clear and understandable ways that parents can use to understand, again, how their own child's school is doing, or if they're not yet enrolled, how they can look at different school options. And so in terms of like the principles we will use in that design, I don't think we're far enough along to say exactly what it will be, other than to say that we're very much centered on sort of what will be meaningful and understandable and usable for parents. There's a couple of guideposts we're looking at. There are some nonprofits that are looking at supporting states around this state report card work and balancing all of the elements that are required federally with this idea of how to make information meaningful for parents. So we're certainly looking at all of that work and creating model templates for states and wanting to learn from the work that, again, these nonprofits are doing in that area. We also want to look at all of the different types of reports we currently have in DC and what parents have found meaningful. We were actually just talking to the My School DC folks yesterday about how they are planning some parent focus groups this summer around how parents are using the My School DC portal right now and using that to make choices and get information. And we're thinking about sort of all of the different mechanisms we could use to actually reach out to parents and engage them, as well as sort of the technical aspects of design and technology that have to go into this. We're assuming that this will need to live on a website of some kind, and thinking about sort of structure of the website and searchability and so on, but also thinking about how there could be some kind of summary function and a hard copy version of that summary. So very early stages on all of that. But I think the concept that people have been sort of raising around a dashboard of breaking out different elements, making that very clear to folks in a sort of visual way, I think that's sort of what is conjured for me by the word dashboard. I think those are very much in line with how we've been thinking about the report card design.
Thank you. Thanks for that. And I would just say that our Proportionate Voices working group that's led by Marcus could potentially be a real help in a number of ways as you're figuring this out. And so I hope that you can work with us closely to make sure that there is parent input in how and given that we're elected and represent various constituencies, hopefully that can be helpful and not a hindrance to your process. And then I just want to say again that I think you guys did a great job in trying to really balance all of the input out there with some real challenges associated with data availability, and at the same time making commitments to improve the way that we're balancing all the various factors associated with accountability going forward. So thank you guys and your team for your hard work.
Thanks, Laura.
And I have to jump off, everybody. I apologize. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Laura.
Bye-bye.
So I'll echo the thank you. I don't want to go in. Everybody's, I think, on the same point here. You've done great work, and we appreciate it. I haven't had a chance to go through in detail yet, but I noticed one little thing in the STAR framework for high school, the ACT, SAT. In the previous, it lists college ready 50th percentile threshold. In the STAR framework, adjusted new, it says DC percentage threshold. Is that a change, and if so, what is that?
Yeah, I think we had not fully defined the 50th percentile threshold before, and so this is, I think, just recognizing that we hadn't fully defined it. As you all know, I think we're still all getting used to the new SAT and seeing what the results will look like from it. I think the idea behind this remains the same, which was always that, similar to how we have both PARCC 4+ and 3+ right now, that when we look at SAT or ACT performance, we want to look at the college ready threshold, but also potentially look at a lower threshold, just because we know that the reality is right now, not all of our students are meeting that college ready threshold, or even a relatively small percentage are. So having sort of two different thresholds we look at can be valuable. So I think the principle is the same, we just clarified anything.
Okay, so are you proposing splitting those points up in some way?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, splitting between those two thresholds.
Some clarification of what that looks like before a vote? When is clarification of that going to come?
Yeah, I think that might be one of the things that's in the full state plan. I know, for example, on AP IB, we had proposed splitting equally between participation and performance, and we just were seeking to simplify some of what we put on the chart. The full state plan should be coming to you all by tomorrow. You missed the beginning of the meeting when I was sharing the U.S. Department of Ed very helpfully issued a new template yesterday at around 1 p.m. So we're still sort of getting everything together.
Sure. So I'll echo the thank you as well. I think the sentiment is pretty accurate that this new draft definitely incorporated a lot of what we heard in warding and around the city. So I'm excited about that. I did have a couple questions. I think one was in the same vein of the comments that Jack made, kind of about how we move forward in fully developing some of the climate and culture metrics. I think, my concern, I echo the concern, is that, I think we want to be a meaningful part of developing this in whatever role is most useful. And we definitely, I think, to Jack's point, again, don't want to write a blank check on some of these things. And I know Laura also mentioned a little earlier, or had the question earlier, about the specific task forces we asked for. And I know that some of that is kind of still being developed. But I think, I think we're in a good place about where we want to go. I think I'm most concerned at this point kind of about the process, like how we're involved moving forward, right, next month, next year, and how we get to a place where whatever metric is whatever metric or whatever we land on is something that we kind of all contributed to. I guess I would like to see, at least in our approval resolution, a contingency on a task force being developed around those two metrics, just so that even if it's a working group, right, so that we're regularly updated and involved in the conversation moving forward, so that whatever is released, whether it has to come back to us or not, we feel comfortable with the final product. So I guess maybe what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would say is we'd love for you to give us a chance to get, again, the commitments through the full state plan to you all by tomorrow, and put some additional thought into sort of what that, what a process can look like. And again, I think part of this distinction is the types of decisions that are made at different levels. I think the point is well taken around the access and opportunities metric, and for example, that is 5 points within the system. That's a lot of points. It is still a couple of years out. There's a lot we will learn from a pilot in the meantime, and I can see why, and we've intentionally left the description relatively open-ended so that that pilot can really fully explore the different options and ideas that people were raising, and I can see why it would be very important, for example, to bring that decision back to the board. There are other parts of the accountability system that can get quite nitty-gritty very quickly, and that are more appropriately made at sort of the level of business rules and decisions in operations. And so I think part of this is about scoping out not just what a process should look like, but what decisions should fall within what level of decision making.
In terms of, we had in our recommendations a section about the disaggregation around economically disadvantaged students. I think we asked that be disaggregated for students who are recipients of TANF and SNAP. Is that something that we're incorporating in this new version?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that gets to more of a data question than a requirement in the accountability system. I think for purposes of accountability, states have typically used two types of definitions, and I think we can explore both, and we've heard interest in exploring both. So one is the current definition we use, which is free and reduced price lunch, and we know that that includes the challenge around community eligible schools. The other definition we've heard states use tends to be direct certified, which is a combination of TANF and SNAP. I think the point that the board has raised before around the distinction between TANF and SNAP is helpful for informational purposes. I don't know of any state that has sought, though, to disaggregate down to that level in the economically disadvantaged category as a whole. So I think we could look at, for informational purposes and for understanding sort of what the breakdown is between those. But I think that I don't think we'd want to limit ourselves to the lower threshold in terms of the term overall for federal.
Because I think the major concern behind that was around the community eligible schools, where students who we in our minds wouldn't necessarily think are economically disadvantaged being pulled in with the other students who very well are, right? And it's skewing the numbers, so.
And I'll just note that at the statewide and the LEA and school level on Park, for example, we have reported out on the at-risk category, and at-risk is limited to TANF, SNAP, homeless, foster, and overage undercredit youth. And what we see at the statewide level is, I think there is a difference of a couple of percentage points between the economically disadvantaged and the at-risk in terms of results. The percentages of students in those categories are actually pretty big, the percentage of students that covers. So I think you all are right that community eligible adds a lot more students to it, but in terms of results, we see some difference, but not a huge one. And again, I think we report on the at-risk category at the LEA and school level as well. I think that's an available option within the results site, results.tc.gov. And just in case the question is on folks' minds, the reason we didn't build in at-risk as the economically disadvantaged definition is because it's a funding category, and so we often see interest in seeking to expand that category to cover additional students because these dollars come with it, and because that it's not necessarily a stable category year over year. And so it's susceptible to the same kind of thing. It's the same motivation that basically led to community eligible, right? It was free reduced price lunch was a definition created to help students access free meals. Everyone wants students to access free meals, but that changed the definition for data purposes.
And I think this is probably my last question. So when we talked about kind of the well-rounded experiences of students, I know that it's mentioned in the document that the intent is to provide flexible options for schools. But I think some of the conversations we were having among the ESSA committee is that we do think that specific things should, schools should be held accountable for providing specific things. So in your mind, what kind of flexibility are we allowing schools, because I think at least my vision is that there should be things, that we hold schools accountable for across the board for providing certain levels of instruction. So what kind of flexibility are you envisioning?
Yeah, and again, I think a lot of this will get developed more through the pilot, but I think there's a couple of reasons why we sort of kept this notion of some flexibility that should be included. I think one option, and I understand sort of the comments that you were sharing, and we've heard the same kind of feedback around there should be some experiences that are sort of standardized across all schools. The reason we included this notion of flexibility is I think one strand of feedback we heard was around this idea of students accessing a broad array of curricular opportunities. So whether that's science and social studies, potentially arts, potentially foreign language, like additional curricular offerings. But I think another strand certainly that we've heard a lot of interest in is the idea of a school climate instrument, right? And measuring climate in a different way. And that this measure, like one direction could potentially be that it could be sort of offering, like show your school environment in an additional way, but choose one of these pathways for doing that, right? And the climate metric could get at some of those questions around the richness of the environment and so on, or you could do it through demonstrating the direct curricular offerings. So that's one reason for sort of this notion of flexibility. Again, I'm not saying that's the direction we go in, but that's one possible schema. I think the other thing is even within sort of the realm of feedback, so let's say we didn't end up going down that road and instead the measure became concrete around this idea of a broad array of curricular offerings. I think even there, the things to take into account of are there are differences between the size of schools, right? So we think about Roots Public Charter School, which I think has about 4 classrooms or 5 classrooms. They're relatively small class sizes. Sort of what it would look like for that school to, if you offered, they do, I know they study science, at least I was there when they were studying science lesson, but beyond that, sort of like what would it look like to require additional subjects when they are quite small, other schools are much larger, right? Or as you think about grade configurations, you can say, yes, some things for high school and some for middle and some for elementary, but what we see is our schools have all kinds of different grade configurations, and so it's very hard to sort of limit in those ways, and the offerings that make sense for a high school may not make sense for, a school that starts in 4th grade or 5th grade, right? And so some of it is just awareness of the different realities our schools face.
So thank you. And I think that was it. I think, just the clarifying points to Jack's point about how, statutorily how we would need to be involved moving forward as we make changes to the framework, I think would be really helpful.
Yeah.
For next week.
So again, like everyone said, I would like to echo what everyone said about feedback from several different parties across the city. Looking at the draft revisions, I know it's been a quick turnaround time, but have you guys been able to do any rough modeling? And if so, have you seen any significant shifts in schooling, especially looking at, I had a question about the stars, but also just in placement of schools, their model, with the models, or do you foresee any significant shifts from the old plan to the new plan?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one thing we did look at is, again, in the addressing chronic absenteeism, the big reason we wanted to shift that metric considerably was, again, seeing, as you all can imagine, that there are some schools that have relatively low percentages of students right now who are present for 90% or more of the school year. So that means, like, there are schools where a lot of kids are actually missing 18 or more days. They are cognizant, I think, that that is a serious problem and doing everything they can to address it, but it may take a while because some of those kids are missing a lot of time and there's a lot of them in that bucket. So it would take a long time to move that measure in a way that really recognizes progress. But when we looked at growth in that measure, we saw very different things. Like some schools are making a ton of progress in that area and others are not. And so we had thought about sort of, do we break them out separately? That seemed like a lot to add up another measure and added complexity. And so developing this best out option was, again, based on the feedback we heard in terms of interest in more growth in the system generally, but also based on our sort of look at that data. This seemed like a good way to recognize and give credit to schools that are making progress in an area, even if they haven't fully got to where they want to be.
Well, another comment. I'd like to personally thank you, and we've had many conversations about this. I'm glad we can finally come to a plan that we can all endorse. If we still have some issues that we can work out at a future date. There are no more questions.
Well, actually, I thought we could do another round if we want to make it more nice or a few more. So first of all, I know I didn't start out by complimenting you, as everybody else did. I'm aware of that, and I apologize for that, especially with the last minute changes made by the department. So I do appreciate that. And I want to note that as I read it, and I have to say my arithmetic is so bad, so changing the denominator really does mess with me. It does seem like the percentage that's going to the test itself does go down a good 10 points, and in years 1 or 2, either a little bit less or a little bit more, which I appreciate. And that, together with changing the proficiency that and the growth that does make a difference. I really do appreciate that. I am concerned that we still don't have models to see how that plays out. I just wanted to note that. And what I do want to throw out is, as I understand it and trying to piece it together, we're 2 years out from anything related, any kind of environment or well-rounded measure different than what was originally proposed. Do I understand that correctly? Granting that you're shifting the attendance improvement, which I also think is a great idea. But in terms of the things that were proposed in terms of well-rounded education and the climate surveys, which have come up a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think the pilot work will certainly begin before that.
Okay. So we're 2 years out from that, and as others have noticed, we don't know what the process is on that. And I do want to note, as I know you are aware, the sense of people's sense of not being included in this and having engagement is huge, and the idea of the task forces was really an idea to get at that. So I hope we will do that and sort of lay that out and put in some commitments on that, and also some commitments about when it would come back. Because, I mean, I am concerned of signing off on something where basically we're saying 3 years out, we're still at only 5 points that are different than what's currently in there. That is kind of a problem for me. And that we have nothing going forward that commits to either a process or a plan in terms of a broader climate, on climate beyond the attendance and enrollment. There's nothing really on that. what we call the well-rounded and the climate.
So I think, again, what we're saying is that we heard that some concern that just a commitment to explore additional measures did not feel like enough to folks. And so this idea is being clear that at a minimum, there's 5 points that are built into the framework on this clear timeline with a path towards development, what that should look like. I think in general, the broad commitment we already made in our draft plan to stepping back and revisiting the whole of the accountability system, looking at all of it in implementation, remains the case. And we have always been clear, I think, that no system, no matter how thoughtfully designed from the beginning, can anticipate all the ways in which it'll play out in implementation. But that we need to see how it does play out to be able to adjust and make tweaks over time to further refine the system. And I shouldn't say tweaks makes it sound, I think, too minimal. I think we are certainly open to continuing to talk about changes at whatever level might be necessary. What I would say, though, is I think the reason, again, that we have built out the timeline as we have is I think you can't underestimate sort of what it takes from an operational perspective, not only in terms of administering a survey instrument or collecting new types of data around course offerings or other types of school environment indicators, not just the collection mechanism at the school level, but the reporting up to the state and the collection and aggregation at the state, and then the verification. I think we see still, even on basic data points like assessments, the processes we use to verify and be able to report on that data are significant. We are still sort of all working through, from the state level, trying to work with LEAs and schools around what those systems look like. And so putting in place something new, this robust, is not, and that's not a DC specific challenge. I think that's, again, why you see so many states who've looked at lots of different options ultimately say, we're not able to do this in year one, but we are, in some cases, committing to do it in out years or committing to continuing this exploring. So I think it comes from some very real operational challenges. That said, again, the move to not just say we will explore further, but to build this into the framework in this concrete way was an acknowledgement of the depth of interest we heard in it and our commitment to working towards that in a concrete way.
And so at that point, potentially it could go, more of these non-testing indicators could be considered and further expand into both the attendance and re-enrollment and into what's in the testing. And is that?
I mean, I think I'm saying that we are open to, that the pilots we've described are not the only changes that we would contemplate in the future.
So two other quick, they're not quick, but two other things. One is around the high school growth, and I know we've been back and forth on this, and especially because what you just said, which is that getting any of these changes into place is itself a long process. It's one of the reasons we were really eager to have a really clear process in year one to try to revisit the high school growth, because I think with no growth, I mean, we've all read the articles that say if you don't put growth in there, and so much of it is academic and it's high school dropout, high school graduate, you know, you might as well make a list of, you know, sort of what's the average income of the kids in a given high school and rank them that way. And I know that's not your intent, but I worry that with no growth, that's sort of what we end up with. And wow, it's a lot of work and a lot of money to do that. And I know, I mean, have you talked with like the Pearson people and the Park people? Because I know one reason we're part of it is that we pay the money and they can spit out these MGPs. So I guess I don't understand why it's so difficult. Obviously you have.
Yes, I would say I talk to Park people all the time. And yes, we have looked at the MGPs that are generated by Pearson, and the same technical challenges remain. That this spring will be the first time we see it. We will look at the numbers at that point as well. But as we've explained, it will take time to calculate the MGPs, just technically. It always takes time to calculate them once results are finalized. And we really need to step back and explore. We don't know what the results will show, because this spring is the first time that students will have taken geometry who took 8th grade math. But what we do know for sure is that close to a third of our students are not on this most common pathway of having taken the 8th grade math test and having taken geometry. And what that does to the results is unknown. But that's a lot of students to be leaving out of the growth calculation. And that's why, you know, again, like, I think it's not just our intent, it's that we fully understand the value of a high school growth measure. We want one. And I think there are different pathways to explore, but it's not an easy thing.
No, I don't think it is. I'm worried if we can't do it that way, then we need to look at some other tests, and if we don't figure that out quickly, we're going to be sitting here 4 years from now. That's what I'm worried about. difficult bar even within the growth for the kids who are further behind, and I wonder if you consider sort of dropping that out.
So I think that's not, so I think what the point was raised was that the point value, the scale score point value that you need to achieve is higher if you start at the lower end. But I think what's unknown, and I think is often up for debate, is actually whether larger point values are harder to accomplish or smaller gains as you get closer to a threshold. And I think we've heard both perspectives. I think with only 1 year park data, 1 year of growth of park data, it's actually hard to know and see the scale score changes that are happening at the individual student level. So I think we're certainly open to continuing to explore that. I think that we are committed to including growth, and we had heard a lot of interest initially in this idea of having 2 different ways of looking at growth, one that is an absolute growth measure like growth through proficiency, and one that's a relative growth measure like MGP, but we're open to continue giving feedback.
And last thing, I just want to align with Marcus's point about switching to the direct certification.
I have a few questions here. One of the things that I am also concerned with is growth in high school, and is it possible that something is part of it so that 9th, 10th, and 11th grade are a part of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the challenge that in DC, I mean, there are a lot of states that test 9th, 10th, and 11th graders. I have not heard a lot of appetite for that here. It's just, I think, a phenomenon of sort of where we are starting. I think there are other states that have always had 9th, 10th, and 11th, and therefore are sort of used to that scheme, and that does allow for generating not just one, but multiple growth measures with the annual testing that way. And that's just not what we have here, and I think it would be pretty hard to shift to that at this point. That said, I think that it is important to look at, right now, it's not a growth measure, but we have sort of multiple points of being able to look at student achievement. We've got ACT, SAT, which is more in the 11th and 12th grade range, and geometry, which is more often taken in the first half of high school. And I think the one thing that's important is sort of making sure there are multiple times when we look at the results of achievement of our students in addition to improvement.
The reason why I brought it up is because I decided to visit and speak with the principal at Banneker to find out how she's growing her children. And she specifically said, I make sure that we budget for ESSA, 9th, 10th, 11th grade. And every year we use that as a measurement to know where children are, what they need, and how we can get at teaching these children like individualized plan for every child. And so I just feel like it's unfair to the rest of the city because they should do that too. Every child deserves an opportunity, every family or principal deserves an opportunity to see the growth up front from the 9th, 10th, and 11th grade. That 11th grade PSAT is determining scholarship. And so it's no accident why children are getting scholarships, not in 11th grade already getting that PSAT score for them, and the universities are connecting with them. It's because they've had 3 years of preparation. And I made that effort to talk to her for the simple fact that I just felt that somewhere along the line it just seems so unfair to everyone else in the system that they don't have that same opportunity. And I'm pretty sure it's probably out of her budget, because what you're saying is if it's not. And is it something we could explore to try with a couple of schools, pilot a couple of schools with that, so we can see, is that gonna make a difference over time?
So I mean, yeah, one thing I'll note is that this is not PSAT, but when it comes to the other park assessments, there is a full suite of park assessments that are offered: Algebra 1, Geometry, and Algebra 2, or Integrated Math 1, 2, and 3. And those aren't required. The other ones are not required statewide, but there are some schools and some LEAs that give them optionally. So we don't report out because they're not given, because they're given voluntarily by those schools, but there are schools that use them for that exact same reason, so that they have year-over-year results on their students, and on a robust rigorous assessment. So there are schools that are doing that, and when schools choose to do that, OSSE to date has been paying for that out of our own budget. So if schools choose to give Algebra 1 to 9th grade or Algebra 2 to 11th grade, for that. I think the other thing is just to note that we have been looking at supporting on advanced courses and advanced assessments of multiple kinds. So we've got a grant at OSSE right now that's around SAT preparation and providing broader access to SAT preparation for students and families who may not otherwise afford it, or schools that don't necessarily have it in their budget. So that's been a grant program at OSSE that's now in its 2nd year and working with a large number of schools across the city. And I think we're certainly open to continue to look at
important since that's our push to get our children college ready. And that if we continue in high school, we use the PARCC exam, we already, that instrument is not one that universities are looking at. They're looking at school, they're looking at the PSAT, the ACT, and the SAT. And that in order to put us in the front of all the other states, in which that's what one of our goals is that we are first at getting our kids there. And are we talking to the universities? That's the question. I guess that's the big question.
We absolutely are. So I think one of the big differences with PARCC was that university faculty were so deeply involved. University faculty from all of the PARCC states were so deeply involved in the development. And there actually are several state university systems. I think the community college systems in Illinois and Massachusetts and in Kentucky and Delaware use PARCC assessments in place of ACT as their placement test to see whether you need remedial coursework or not in place of, but in addition to. And on the Smarter Balance side, there's actually even more universities that use it. And I know one thing that the consortia are exploring could there be a reciprocity agreement, so if you look at either. So I think that work with higher ed is ongoing. PARCC is still relatively new, but I agree that the engagement with higher ed is really important. We've had the same discussion with UDC, where a number of our graduates go around them sort of adopting the same principles.
And so my final question is, maybe I'm not getting it, but the alternative graduation rate, I know it's 5 years, 6 years. Does it also include, and I'm not sure on this, because I don't quite understand the state program, are they getting degrees in that program as well? Is that included in here?
So the state program, I think, generally issues GED or anything. So thanks to the work of the board and also in partnership, those graduates get a state diploma, but they're not counted in this grad rate. The grad rate calculation is developed by the U.S. Department of Ed and is limited to certain categories that don't include GED in it.
Could I ask one question in relation to Dr. Woodruff's concern around the growth metric? What would be the worst case scenario of building in a growth metric at the high school level, but not putting it into effect until maybe 18, 19, or 19, 20?
Yeah, I mean, I think the hesitation around that is because I think there is some uncertainty around, I think that the path for assessments in high school is still a little bit open-ended. I think the interest you expressed in SAT is something we hear from schools as well. I think I have some concerns about going down that path that would need to be fully addressed first. In particular, College Board this year issued a new accommodations policy. Before that, we'd heard a lot of concerns from special education advocates around the lack of accommodations available in special ed. And obviously, given our history in DC, that's one that we would need to immediately make sure was fully vetted. Again, the College Board has made a change, and we're still sort of seeking to understand that policy and how it's playing out to see if that addresses the accommodation side of this. I think in addition, the new test design with the SAT we want to understand, and there's some other areas as well. But I think that part of it is any change in assessment scheme would really affect timeline for development and growth measure. We'd be setting a baseline, we'd be setting and sort of the development pathway from there, and it would depend a lot on sort of what the different configurations of that looked like. So that's been our hesitation around setting forth a date certain. Whereas, with the access and opportunities measure, we feel like even though there's a lot that's unknown, we feel confident we can develop something that's appropriate in the timeline we've laid out on high school growth. I think it's a little more uncertain.
I might just kind of be ignorant to the technicalities around it, but if we're already including part proficiency at the high school level, what's the difference, right, in kind of assessing or in kind of including that data? I know you can assess it from the previous school year, but we all are acknowledging that at least maybe 1 or 2 years down the line, we're going to have kind of a full suite of data that we could assess on a growth metric, right? So it's not connecting with me why we can't include that somewhere down the line.
Yeah, just to give one example, right? So one thing we've heard suggested is, could we move to SAT being our required state assessment and then develop a growth measure that was PSAT to SAT? There are a whole bunch of unknowns within that one statement. Again, there's the question of is SAT suitable for a state assessment, and some reassurances we would need, I think, on that front. Then there's could you develop a growth measure from PSAT to SAT? Some people say it's theoretically possible, but it's never, there isn't an existing one. And so what would that look like? What would it take to develop it? Is the alignment there from the test design side, et cetera? And then what would it look like to do that, given that SAT is a proprietary cutoff? So there's a lot that you would have to factor in. And so yes, even though SAT and ACT are built in here as based on the current results that we get, that wouldn't answer anywhere near the sort of questions we have in that kind of statement. And that's one possible pathway. I think there's a lot of others around assessment.
But what about the ELA going 8 to 10 on the ELA, which doesn't have those same issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, we would want to look at the results and just see what does it look like if you're only looking at ELA versus having both ELA and math, and sort of does that, you know, are there schools that did stronger on ELA and math, or one versus the other? And so in the lower grades where we have both, like, what does it look like relative to that? And so, again, if that turned out to be a viable option, I think we would be very interested in that, but if we feel like it's a lot to commit to without having even seen the results for one cycle.
Is there a possibility that after seeing the spring results that you would be able to commit to that for next year? I mean, once you look at them?
I think it's unlikely. I hate to foreclose all possibilities, but I think it is unlikely just given the timeline for return when we would be able to do that analysis. And then what we've historically heard from schools is that they do not feel comfortable adding metrics once the school year has started. So
It wouldn't change, in this case, it wouldn't change anything they did. It's just how you calculate the test result.
Even if it takes effect the following year. I think I'll echo the response or the comments so far. I really want to see a growth measure for high schools, whatever that is, and I hear a lot about the data and the limitations with data. Fully get that. But I think at some point we need to know that there is a path forward, and we'll develop a process to get that piece of data that we need to have a true growth measure. And I think there's public will to push that. So as we're thinking about the final, whether it's the resolution or however this is worded, if we can get a commitment that comes back, and there's a clear timeline that we'll have another conversation, is, as you know, the board can't initiate policy. So if we adopt this, we can't force you to bring it back to us. But in adopting this, if we can have a clear agreement that will come back and that we can have another conversation in 6 months or a year or whatever that appropriate timeline is, so that we can go back to our constituents and say, Aussie understands this, they're working on it. We're still not there from the data's perspective, but we are committed to getting there. That will go a long way towards instilling public confidence that we're doing what's right and not what's easy.
Yeah, I understand and I appreciate that. I think, you know, certainly I know that one underlying fear that we've heard is that, you know, we might go through all this public engagement and not make changes. And I think hopefully this helps put that to rest. I understand that there's still sort of other concerns, and I get that, like, having.
And I'd say likewise, just as Joe said, likewise having sort of a set of commitments and a process and a timeline on these other indicators. I know we talk about climate differently than you do. So like the climate survey, the ideas about teacher retention, the things about climate that are different from the attendance, because I don't so much agree with that, but the attendance really captures it. So it's the other climate indicators less than relevant. Timeline on that.
Sure.
Oh, I will. It's probably, I think this one truly is straightforward, which is, we had heard, but we didn't actually, get any, response back, that it was legal under the federal law for, new ELLs to not, count the park for 3 years. Do I understand from your response that that's not a federal that's not an option within the federal law?
I don't believe so. I think our teams looked at them quite closely, the different options, and the response here laid out.
So that it's just, all you can do is miss the first year in terms of it.
Yeah, I think there may be some confusion around, there are a couple of different provisions around ELLs, and I think there may have been some confusion of the different ones on the participation assessments. Our understanding is what we laid out.
In regards to special education,
alternate assessment, MSAA. We have, I think about citywide, about 14% of our students have IEPs. And in part, there's a robust set of accommodations. That's what I was flagging on the College Board and SAT side, that historically, SAT has not had the same robust range of accommodations that student assessments will.
So, closing for me.
There's
There's that I would love to see that I'm hearing, is just a paragraph about looking into science over the next couple of years and how it could possibly be a part of the academic achievement as well as possibly, you can't do growth, but you can do possibly academic achievement in the future on, so that our constituents know that STEM is very important to us. And just putting it in there in words so everyone knows up front, that's your goal as well. Goes a long way. Goes a long way. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
I like to, if you all don't mind, can we just give them a hand? I'd just like to thank you. Like I said, there's still a lot of issues that have to be worked on, and a lot of things that we have to agree on, but I think we've made tremendous strides. And we're happy to be of assistance to you.
We really appreciate your all's partnership, and I really meant what I said in my opening around, I think the partnership around engagement has made the plan stronger, and we really appreciate, again, Ruth's work in chairing the committee and all of your leadership.
Keep it long enough. Are there any other issues that I can put on? Then I'll make a motion.
So moved.
That's it.